Hello, my name is Judith Rossall and my theme for this video is the Bible and shame. Or let's be honest, my theme really is much more specific than that, because what I really want to argue is that the Bible has a lot to say about shame, far more than I can cover in one fairly short video, but that we often don't notice it. So actually, what I want to talk about is a few highlights of what I learned about shame as I tried to grapple with everything that the Bible has to say. So I started, like so many other people started, with a rereading of the story of Adam and Eve. Such a familiar story. And yet one day I suddenly noticed what a key part shame plays in that story. Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit and something changes in them before God gets to do anything at all. They go from being naked and unashamed. That's a beautiful image, I think, of a very open relationship in which they feel free to show each other exactly who they are. But they go from that, they eat the forbidden fruit, and suddenly we have a story of them hiding and them trying to cover up their own shame by making fig leaves for themselves. And that all happens well before God gets to do anything at all. Sin has distorted their living before God's judgment on what they've done is ever even mentioned. And when I finally noticed that raised a huge question for me. What else does the Bible say about shame that somehow or other I've never noticed? Is there something to be learned around the fact that the church has told us so often that the gospel is all about our guilt, that's what we've been taught to look for when we read the Bible? Does the Bible actually have a lot to say about shame that we've overlooked? And I think the answer is yes. And once you learn to see what the Bible says about shame, you can't unsee it. Suddenly you begin to realize that it's a theme that runs all the way through Scripture. Certainly for me, the next thing that I noticed is that the Exodus is all about shame. Think about it for a moment. The Exodus is the story of a people who go from a situation of slavery. Think how shaming that is. Then they are set free by one powerful act. Think how wonderful that feels. So now they're free, right? Except when you read the story of what happens in the desert, well, isn't it a story of actually their internal lives have to catch up? Just because they've been set free externally doesn't mean that they aren't still struggling with shame. They actually have to learn what it means to live as a free child of God. What a fantastic image of what it's going to be like for so many of us to move out of a life which is dominated by shame into a life as the child of God. It's an exodus, and it might be long and painful, but we are promised that God will always be with us on the way. And having noticed that, well, that set me up for what I think might be a lifetime of work, trying to understand everything that the Bible has to say about shame. Reading the Bible about shame also taught me that shame is a very individual experience, but it's more than that. We live in a society which emphasises the individual and which has taught us in many ways to see shame as an individual problem. It is, after all, such a personal, powerful experience. Somebody once said it shrinks the soul. It pushes us inside our own heads, partly because it makes us want to escape the gaze of other people, so it tempts us to run away and be by ourselves. And that tempts us also to think that we have to heal our shame by ourselves. So very often when we're struggling, we turn to psychologists and therapists, and it's good that we do that. They do wonderful work. But the Bible has taught me that the problem is bigger. The Bible's also taught me to be very suspicious of the way in which we so often tell people, oh, the answer's easy, just don't worry about what people think of you. Well, can anybody actually really do that? And if we could, would that be a good thing? At what point does saying, I don't care what you think about me, fall over into saying, I don't care about you? Reading the Bible has taught me to see shame as a much bigger issue. Let me put it this way. Adam and Eve respond to their shame, first of all, by making fig leaves to cover themselves. And then very quickly, they start blaming each other and the serpent for what happened. Why? Because one way in which we deal with our shame is to try to pass it on to somebody else. It wasn't really me, it was you. We get ourselves caught up in what I've come to see as cycles of shame and blame. We cover our own shame with what I've come to call our fig leaves, and very often our fig leaves are actually not that helpful. They hurt us in the long term, and they also hurt other people. The Bible takes groups and relationships very seriously. Both positively and negatively, we are caught up in our friendships, our family, our society, and they shape us in who we are inside, as well as our external relationships. We were meant to flourish in healthy, loving relationships, and we are very capable of damaging each other. That's why, in order to talk about shame, we also need new and better ways of talking about sin. Far too often, we have learned to see sin as being purely about our own individual transgressions. It's just about what we've done wrong, or not in the Bible. In the Bible, the sin is something much more nuanced and also much bigger. It's a power which infects us and oppresses us, from which we need liberation. And it's something which both results from and results in shame. Next highlight that grappling with the Bible on shame has helped me to really understand. And that is that actually, if shame is a problem, so is being shameless. A lot of writers talk about this, but most of the time it's like we mention it and then we pass on. There is a way in which shame is good, because shame is caught up in how other people see us, or at least how we imagine that other people see us. And actually, it matters that I care about how other people see me, because that keeps me respecting other people properly. It leads to a proper form of modesty. As one writer has put it, it makes sure that when I get up in the morning, I do actually clean myself up, present myself in a way which actually means I'm nice to be around. That matters. And being shameless is very dangerous, especially if the shameless person has a hold on power. Jeremiah has a fabulous phrase. He talks about how dangerous it is when leaders forget how to blush. In other words, he criticizes the leaders of Israel because they are so caught up in their own interests, because they are exploiting others to such an extent that they have lost touch with something which is actually deeply human, a basic understanding that others matter too, a basic respect for the human life of those that they were meant to be leading. Shamelessness combined with power is a particularly dreadful form of sin. When a sin is committed, far too often our version of the gospel focuses on the person who did the sinning. They, we understand, are likely, hopefully, to feel guilt, and we have a gospel of forgiveness. But what I eventually learned is that the Bible also helps us to pay attention to the voice of the person who has been sinned against. If you think about it, the Exodus is all about the story of people who were sinned against. They were subject to the ruthless power of Pharaoh, and they needed to be rescued. And then they needed to deal with the shame which came out of the sin they had experienced committed against them. And one thing I learned from reading the Bible is how often when a sin is committed, the perpetrator might experience guilt, but the victim will often experience shame. Somebody who has been sexually abused, a victim of fraud, a victim of violence, a victim of so many ways in which sins are committed against human beings. They come out of the experience feeling diminished, unwanted, less of a person. And that's before we get on to the very real trauma that they experience. And yet the church has not been good at all at listening to the people who are sinned against. The victims of racism, any form of discrimination, they've had to shout loudly to get us to really hear. And yet, read the Bible carefully, and there's a great deal there about the people who are sinned against, and not least the way in which Jesus stands with them. So here's my final point. What reading the Bible on shame has taught me above all is both to value for myself and to want to talk to other people about the whole idea that Jesus has experienced shame as well. I actually believe that we have to learn to reread the Gospels, understanding that they are ancient documents which speak about shame in a particular way, so they don't spend a great deal of time delving into Jesus' own personal experience of shame. What they do is they tell us a story of somebody who starts off being honoured by everybody around them, and yet who ends the story being shamed by everyone around them. And crucifixion was deliberately designed to be the single most shameful experience possible. And I think that really matters, because if somebody is struggling with absolute overwhelming shame, that can leave you feeling like you are the only person who has ever felt like this. Shame is incredibly isolating. What's more, if you are struggling with shame, talk of an all-powerful, all-seeing God might actually be the very last thing that you want to hear. If you've been the victim of somebody else's overwhelming power, why would you want to know about an overwhelmingly powerful God? So, the one thing I learned, perhaps above all, by reading the Bible about shame, is to recognize that the Gospels tell a really powerful story of how Jesus experienced the very depths of shame. And that the Gospel, therefore, has to include the message that he understands just how appalling and overwhelming shame can be. And we can trust God because Jesus was God incarnate. In other words, our ultimately powerful creative God has also gone to the very depths of shame with us. And it is our shamed Messiah who asks for our trust and who will ultimately lead us in our own personal exodus out of shame. So let me ask you 3 questions. You, of course, may think that what I've said brings up some entirely different questions, in which case I hope we get a chance to discuss those questions. But this is what I would like to ask you to reflect on. Is there a biblical passage which has helped you either to understand something new about shame or something about your own experience of shame? Or is there a biblical passage which has particularly helped you to deal with shame? If so, what is it? Number 2, what danger do you think somebody who is shameless poses to other people? And you might want to think about that particularly in the context of somebody who holds power over others. And then finally, do you find the idea that Jesus experienced the very depths of human shame a helpful or a fruitful one? If so, why? And if not, why not?